Run a check on your sister. My wife Emily said it so quietly that the words barely made it across the dinner table. She was leaning slightly toward me, her mouth close to my ear, her voice folded underneath the noise of the room. Around us, the whole family was mid-celebration. My niece Jessica had just knocked over her water glass and was laughing about it while her husband sopped it up with a napkin. My father was saying something to the man beside him. His voice raised the way it always was when he was proud of something. My sister Sarah stood at the far end of the table, glass lifted, smiling at the room with the easy confidence of someone who had learned a long time ago how to occupy the center of things without appearing to ask for it. I smiled at nothing in particular, and set down my fork. The dinner was in honor of Sarah. The town had named her its annual honored citizen, which was the kind of thing that happens in small places when someone has built a large enough reputation over enough years. The mayor had presented the certificate earlier that afternoon at a brief ceremony in the community center. There had been applause. There had been a photograph. Sarah had stood straight and said thank you in that measured way of hers, and the people in the room had felt, I think, that they were in the presence of someone who had earned the right to be modest. She was wearing a navy blazer. Pinned to it were 3 medals. I had seen those medals before, over the years. On certain occasions she brought them out. Veterans Day, Memorial Day, the occasional invitation to speak at a school or a Legion event. I had never thought to question them. Why would I? She was my older sister. She had served. These were facts as settled in my mind as the name of our childhood street. Now, with Emily's 7 words still warm in my ear, I looked at those medals and felt something I could not quite name. Not suspicion exactly. More like the sensation you get when a piece of furniture you have walked past 1,000 times is suddenly 2 inches from where it always was. And the room feels wrong before your eyes have confirmed why. I reached for my wine glass. Across the table, my father was laughing now, that deep roll of a laugh that had filled rooms my entire life. He was 79 years old, and his hair had gone fully white, and his hands showed the decades he had spent working at the County Water Authority. But when he laughed, he still sounded like the man who used to throw a baseball in the backyard on summer evenings. He was looking at Sarah when he laughed. He was almost always looking at Sarah. After dinner, when the plates had been cleared and my niece was cutting slices of the chocolate cake she had driven 2 hours to bring, I leaned toward Emily and spoke as quietly as she had spoken to me. I said, "What do you mean?" She did not look at me. She was watching Sarah accept a slice of cake with a gracious smile. Emily said, "I mean what I said." I said, "That is my sister." Emily said, "I know who she is, Mark." Then she turned and looked at me with the expression I had come to understand over 24 years of marriage. It was not the expression of suspicion or drama. It was the expression of a woman who had spent 30 years as a detective in this city, who had learned to distinguish between what she felt and what she saw, and who was now telling me clearly that what she saw had concerned her enough to say something. I looked back at my sister. Sarah was talking to Jessica, touching her daughter's arm, and whatever she said made Jessica throw her head back and laugh. Sarah looked pleased. She looked the way she always looked at these gatherings, settled and sure, as though she had constructed her life with deliberate hands and was content to live inside it. I thought, Emily is wrong, but I did not go back to my cake. The story of Sarah in our family was not complicated. It was the kind of story that becomes so familiar over time that you stop hearing it as a story at all and start hearing it as fact. She was 8 years older than me. When I was very young, she was already a figure more than a presence, someone who existed at the edges of my childhood in flashes. The smell of her shampoo when she bent down to tie my shoes before school, the sound of her voice on the phone when she called from wherever she was stationed, and my father's whole bearing changing as he listened. Standing up a little straighter, answering her questions with pride compressed into every syllable. She was never fully home after she enlisted. Even when she was in the house, she seemed to belong to something larger than the house. My father had talked about her enlistment the way other men talked about winning something. He was not a boastful man by nature. He was quiet, practical. The kind of man who showed up on time and did the work and did not expect acknowledgement. But Sarah joining the army had loosened something in him. He told his coworkers. He told the men at his church. He kept a photograph of her in uniform on the shelf above his workbench in the garage, next to the photograph of my mother who had died when I was 11. 2 photographs. That shelf said everything about what mattered most to him. Over the years, Sarah's story had accumulated details the way a river accumulates silt, layer by layer until the shape of the bottom is something different from what it began as. She had served in difficult postings. She had led people through situations she declined to describe in full. She had come home changed, quieter in certain ways, more certain in others. She did not talk about her service often, which the family read as dignity, as the natural reticence of someone who had seen things that did not belong at dinner tables. Jessica had grown up in the long shadow of that story. She was 28 now, married, living 2 towns over, but she had spent her adolescence treating her mother as a kind of proof that women could be strong in the specific way that the world sometimes required. She had considered enlisting herself twice. Both times Sarah had counseled her gently toward other paths without ever explaining why, and I had thought at the time that this was a mother protecting a daughter from hardship. I had not thought about it again until now. Emily had retired from the detective bureau 3 years ago. Her knees had given her trouble for a decade and the paperwork had become, she said, indistinguishable from punishment. But retirement had not changed her eyes. She still noticed things. She noticed the way people held their bodies when they were telling the truth versus the way they held them when they were managing a story. She had told me once, early in our marriage, that she could not turn it off. That seeing was just what her brain did, the way other people's brains did math or music without trying. I had asked her, after the guests left and we were washing dishes in my father's kitchen, what had she seen? She dried a glass before answering. She said, "The medals." I said, "What about them?" she said. "The way she touches them, or does not touch them. There is a difference between a person who wears something that belongs to them and a person who wears something that does not. It is small. Most people would not notice." I said, "You are saying my sister bought fake medals," Emily said. "I am saying the way she handles them is the way a person handles something borrowed, and that the story she told your father tonight about a specific operation did not match the timeline she has described in the past," I said. She misspoke. People misspeak. Emily set down the glass. She said, "Mark, I would not have said anything if I was not sure enough to say it. You know that." I did know that. In 24 years I had almost never seen Emily raise an alarm that turned out to be nothing. That was the problem. I finished the dishes in silence. On the drive home, I watched the town move past the window, the gas stations and the hardware store and the Methodist church, where my father had attended every Sunday for 40 years. Ordinary things, carrying the ordinary weight of a life I thought I understood. I thought about Sarah at the head of the table, the medals on her jacket, the laugh that had made my father's whole face open up. I thought about Emily's words. I did not sleep well. I want to be honest about the week that followed, because the impulse to make it sound cleaner than it was would be a kind of dishonesty I do not want to practice. I did not approach it like a man conducting a search. I approached it like a man trying to prove something wrong. I sat at my laptop in the kitchen after Emily had gone to bed, and I typed names and dates into search fields with the specific hope that nothing would come back. I wanted the absence of information. I wanted gaps that could be explained by the ordinary imprecision of public records. I wanted to close the laptop and go to bed and tell Emily in the morning that she had been mistaken, that sometimes even the best observers miss the mark, and that Sarah was exactly who she had always been. The first thing I found was a service record that did not match. Not dramatically. Not in a way that would mean anything to someone who did not know what to look for. The discharge date was earlier than Sarah's story required, by several years. I stared at it for a long time. I told myself that records had errors. I told myself that the information available through public databases was often incomplete, fragmented, not the full picture. I told myself there was an explanation. I closed the laptop and went to bed. In the morning I opened it again. The second thread I pulled came from a cousin on my father's side, a man named Gerald who had spent the better part of his career working in military logistics before retiring to a house in western Pennsylvania, with a vegetable garden, and a CB radio he still used for reasons he had never fully explained. I called him on a Tuesday evening under the pretense of catching up, which was not entirely a pretense because Gerald and I did catch up. We talked about his garden and his wife's hip surgery, and the new road construction that had added 15 minutes to his commute to the grocery store. and then I said casually that I had been thinking about Sarah lately, about her service, and that I had been trying to understand the unit she had served with. Gerald was quiet for a moment. He said, "Which unit are we talking about?" I told him what Sarah had described over the years, the designation, the general region. "The time frame," Gerald said. I said, "Does that track with what you know?" He said, "The unit existed. But the deployment timeline you are describing does not line up with where that unit was during those years. There is about a 4-year window where what you are saying and what I know do not match." I said, "Is it possible the records are wrong?" Gerald said. "It is possible. But 4 years is a big error." After we hung up, I sat at the table for a long time. The kitchen was quiet. Outside it was raining, the slow, steady kind that made the afternoon feel sealed off from the rest of the world. I thought about the 4-year gap. I thought about what a person does with 4 years that cannot be accounted for in the story they have told. Then I remembered the box. When my mother died, she had left behind a collection of things that did not organize themselves into any clear category. Letters, photographs, small objects that had meant something to her for reasons she had never explained. My father had kept the box in the spare room for years and never gone through it. After he moved to the smaller house, I had taken the box. It had sat in our hall closet for the better part of a decade. I had opened it twice. I had not gone through it properly. I went and got it. It took me 40 minutes to work through the layers of it. Old birthday cards, a rosary, photographs of people I could not identify, and near the bottom, folded into thirds and tucked inside, a church bulletin from 1987, a letter written in Sarah's handwriting. It was addressed to our father. It had never been sent. I unfolded it carefully. The paper had gone soft with age. The handwriting was Sarah's, but younger, less controlled. The letters pressing harder in some places than others, the way handwriting does when the hand behind it is carrying something. It said, "Dad, I have been trying to write this letter for 3 months and I still do not know how to say what I need to say. I know you told everyone. I know what it means to you. I know that picture is on your shelf. I do not know how to tell you that I let you down. I do not know how to come home and be what you think I am. I am sorry. I am trying to figure out what comes next. I love you, your daughter, Sarah." There was no date. There was no explanation of what she had let him down about. There did not need to be. I sat on the closet floor holding that letter for a long time. The rain continued outside. Emily came to the doorway after a while and looked at me and then at the letter, and she did not say anything. She just sat down beside me on the floor, which is what she does when something is real enough that words would make it smaller. After a while she said, "What do you want to do?" I said, "I need to talk to someone who was actually there." The name took me 2 more days to find. It came through a veterans community directory that Emily knew how to navigate in ways I did not. Patricia Owens. She had served in the same unit during the relevant years. She had retired as a major. She now lived in a town in Central Florida and worked part-time at a garden center, which I knew because her name appeared in a local newspaper profile about veterans who had built second careers doing things they loved. I called her on a Thursday afternoon. I sat in my car in the parking lot of a grocery store because I did not want to be inside the house when I made the call. I did not examine that choice too carefully. She answered on the 4th ring. I said, "Major Owens. My name is Mark Garrett. My sister is Sarah Garrett. She served in your unit. I apologize for calling without warning, and I want to be straightforward with you about why I am calling." There was a pause. Then she said, "How did you find me?" I told her. She made a small sound that was not quite a laugh. She said, "And what is it you are trying to find out?" I said, "I am trying to understand my sister's service record. There are some things that do not add up, and I am hoping you can help me understand why." Another pause. Longer this time. I could hear something in the background, a television or a radio, and then the sound of it being turned down. She said, "What kind of things?" I told her about the timeline, about the discharge date that did not match, about the deployment record that Gerald had described. I kept my voice even. I was not accusing anyone of anything. I was asking questions. Patricia Owens was quiet for a moment after I finished. Then she said, "Your sister was a capable person. I want you to know that before I say anything else. She was smart and she had instincts that some people spend a whole career trying to develop. When she first arrived, she impressed people who were not easily impressed, I said. She said. But she had a problem with authority that went beyond ordinary friction. There are people who push back on orders because they are thinking clearly and the order is wrong. And that kind is valuable if they have the judgment to go with it. And there are people who push back because they cannot accept that someone else gets to make decisions about their actions. And that kind is dangerous in a structure that runs on trust. I said, which kind was Sarah? She said, the second. She was brilliant, and she was reckless, and she did not believe that the rules applied to her in the same way they applied to everyone else. There were 2 incidents. One involved a failure to follow a direct order during a sensitive operation. The other involved a judgment call she made unilaterally that put 2 other people at risk. Neither incident resulted in anything catastrophic. But the pattern was clear, I said, and she was discharged. Patricia said. She was given the opportunity to separate voluntarily. Which she took. I do not know what she told her family. That was not my concern. I said. She has told her family that she served for over 2 decades and was honorably retired. Patricia was quiet for a moment. She said that is not accurate. I said, and the medals she wears at public events. Another silence. Longer, she said. I cannot speak to what she wears now. I can tell you what she earned during her time in service. It was not nothing, she did serve. But combat decorations were not among what she earned. I said, thank you for your time. She said, Mr. Garrett. I am sorry. I mean that. Whatever she told your family, I think I understand why. I do not think she is a bad person. I think she is a person who could not survive her own failure and built something else to live inside of instead. It happens more than people know. I thanked her again and ended the call. I sat in the parking lot for a long time after that. People came and went around me, pushing carts, loading groceries, living the ordinary afternoon. I watched them without seeing them. Through the windshield the sky had gone the flat gray of late afternoon, and the light was thin and even and without shadow. I thought about my father's shelf, the 2 photographs. The one of my mother and the one of Sarah in uniform. I thought about the letter that had never been sent. I thought about the word that Patricia Owens had used, failure, and the word she had used after it, built. Then I started the car and drove home. I should explain something about Emily and me because it matters to the shape of what happened. We met in our late 20s at a point in both our lives when we had each already become, more or less, the people we were going to be. She was a detective working property crimes, and I was an accountant with a firm that handled mid-sized commercial clients, which meant I spent my days looking for the places where numbers told stories that the people behind them did not want told. We were not opposites. We were, in a certain sense, the same kind of person operating in different rooms. We both knew what it looked like when the presented version of something did not match the underlying reality. We had both built careers around that knowledge. What this meant in practice was that our marriage had always been unusually honest, not because we were noble, but because deception was professionally exhausting for both of us, and we had agreed somewhere in the unspoken negotiations of early marriage not to bring the work home in that particular way. We did not hide things from each other. We did not manage each other's perceptions. When something was difficult, we said so. When one of us was wrong, we said that too, which was sometimes harder. It also meant that when Emily said something with the calm specificity she had used at that dinner table, I knew it was not a guess. She had seen something. She had considered it. She had decided it was worth saying. That knowledge sat in my chest for the entire drive home and was still sitting there when I woke up the next morning. I lay in the dark for a while before getting up, listening to Emily's breathing beside me, and I thought about the family I thought I had and the family I might actually have, and about the distance between those two things, which was either very small or very large, and I did not yet know which. The morning after the dinner, I called my father under the pretense of thanking him for the evening. He was pleased to hear from me, as he always was, and we talked for 20 minutes about nothing consequential. His neighbor's oak tree had dropped a branch onto the fence line, and they were working out an arrangement about the repair costs. The congregation at church had taken up a collection for a family whose house had flooded. Small things, ordinary things. At some point he said, "Sarah looked wonderful last night, did she not?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Those years show in her, but in the right way. She looks like someone who has earned something." I said, Yes, he said. I told my friend at the pharmacy about the award. He had read about it in the paper already. Your sister has built a real life, Mark, a real and honorable life. I said she has. After we hung up, I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee going cold and thought about the word honorable, and the weight it was carrying in my father's mouth, and what it would cost him if that weight turned out to be distributed wrong. Then I opened the laptop and started looking. Sarah lived 20 minutes from us, in a house she had owned for 15 years. It was a well-kept house, the kind where the bushes were always trimmed and the porch was always swept, the kind of house that announced its owner was someone who kept things in order. She had a garden along the south-facing fence that she tended with the same steady attention she brought to everything. Tomatoes in summer, chrysanthemums in fall. She was out there when I arrived, crouched over a bed of late-season plants with a small spade in her hand, her back to the driveway. She heard my car and turned. When she saw it was me, her expression shifted in a way I would not have noticed a week ago. It was brief, almost nothing. A small tightening around the eyes. A recalibration so fast it was nearly invisible. Nearly she stood and pulled off her garden gloves. She said, "This is a surprise." Her voice was warm and normal. I said, "Can we talk?" She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "Come inside." We sat at her kitchen table, the same place we had sat for every difficult conversation we had ever had. There was something about kitchen tables in this family, the way they anchored things that needed anchoring. She made coffee without asking whether I wanted any, and I watched her move around the kitchen with the practiced ease of someone who knew exactly where everything was. And I thought about how well you can know the geography of a person's life without knowing the person. She set the mugs down and sat across from me. She folded her hands on the table. She looked at me with those steady eyes of hers and she waited. I said, "I spoke with Patricia Owens." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. Sarah did not flinch. She did not look away. She held very still in the way that people hold still when they have been waiting for a specific thing for a long time and it has finally arrived and the waiting is over. After a moment she said, "How did you find her?" I said, "Emily." Sarah nodded once, "Of course," she said. Not with bitterness, with something closer to resignation. I said, "How long?" She said, "How long what?" I said, "How long have you been telling this story?" She looked down at her hands. She said, 30 years, give or take. I had known it was coming. I had known it since the parking lot, since the phone call, since the letter I had found folded inside a church bulletin. But hearing it said plainly, in my sister's voice, in her kitchen, on an ordinary Friday afternoon was different from knowing it. The number landed in my chest and sat there, I said. The medals. She did not answer immediately. She looked at the table. Then she said, "I bought them online." A few years after I came home, when I started getting invited to things, I said, "Which things?" She said, "Veterans Day at the school. The Legion dinner, Dad's retirement party." He wanted me to wear my uniform, and I did not have the decorations that the story required, and I did not know how to explain that. So I found what I needed and I wore it and nobody asked. I said, "Nobody asked because they trusted you," she said. "I know." I said, "Jessica has been talking about enlisting her entire life because of you. Because of the person she thought you were." Something moved through Sarah's face at that. Not guilt exactly. Something older and more complicated than guilt, she said. "I know. I have talked her out of it twice," I said. "I noticed that." "I thought you were protecting her from hardship," she said. "I was protecting her from following a story that was not real." I looked at her across the table. I had rehearsed a version of this conversation in my mind during the drive over. In that version I had been clear and direct and slightly cold, the way you are when you have evidence and you are presenting it. But sitting in front of her I found that the coldness had not survived the distance between the car and the kitchen. What was left was something less organized and more honest. I said, "Why, Sarah? That is what I cannot fit together. You were discharged, not imprisoned. People leave the military early for all kinds of reasons. You could have come home and told the truth and built a life from there." She was quiet for a moment. She turned the coffee mug slowly in both hands, not drinking from it, just turning it. Then she said, "Do you remember what Dad said when I enlisted?" I said I did. She said, "He called his foreman at the water authority. His foreman called someone else." By the time I finished basic training, people I had never met were coming up to my father at the gas station and saying they were proud of his daughter. He put the photograph on the shelf. He told the men at church. He had spent his entire life doing work that nobody celebrated, and here was something he could hold up and say, "Look what came from me, look what I made." She paused. She said, "I came home in under 4 years. No combat record. A voluntary separation that was not really voluntary. I had failed at the one thing that had made my father stand up straight for the first time in his life." I said, "So you did not tell him?" She said, "I could not tell him. I tried. I wrote the letter. I wrote it 6 times. I could never send it because every time I finished it I imagined his face and I could not do it." I said, "I found the letter." She looked up, I said. "It was in Mom's box with her things." Sarah closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them they were wet at the edges, but she did not cry. She said, "I hid it there because I could not throw it away and I could not send it and I needed it to exist somewhere that was not in my hands." I said, "The story just kept going." She said, "Yes. At first I only let people assume things. I did not correct what they already believed. Then the assumptions grew and the corrections became harder, and then they became impossible. Dad got older. His friends started dying, the men he had bragged to. He would introduce me to new people and I could see what it meant to him. That moment of saying my daughter served, and by then I was so far in that I did not know what telling the truth would leave him with." She looked at me directly. She said, "I know that is not a justification. I know that. I am not asking you to tell me it was all right because it was not all right. I am just trying to explain the shape of it, how it started and why it did not stop." I sat with that for a long time. Outside the window the fall garden moved slightly in the afternoon wind. I said, "Emily has known for a while." Sarah said, "I suspected. She has looked at me differently for a few years now." "Your wife has very precise eyes," I said. "She does." A silence settled between us. Not hostile. Something more like two people sitting in the wreckage of something they are both trying to understand from the inside. Then I said, "You have to tell Dad." Sarah looked at me. I said, "Not Emily, not me, not in a letter that gets hidden in a box. You have to sit down with him and tell him yourself, everything." Her jaw tightened. She said, "It will break something in him." I said, "The lie is already breaking something in him. He just does not know what the thing is." She said, "I do not know if I can do it." I said, "I will be there. I will sit in the room and I will not leave. But it has to be you." She looked at the table for a long time, then she said, "And if I cannot?" I said, "Then I will tell him myself. But I do not want to do that. I want it to come from you. He deserves for it to come from you." The afternoon light was thinning in the kitchen windows. Sarah sat very still, her hands wrapped around the mug, her eyes on the table. She looked smaller than she had at the dinner 2 weeks ago, which I realized was just what she actually looked like without the architecture of the story holding her up. Finally she said, "All right." I said, "Tomorrow morning." She said, "Yes." My father opened the door the next morning in his robe and slippers, which meant he had not yet gone through his daily routine of getting dressed before 7 regardless of whether he had anywhere to be. He looked at me and then at Sarah, and something in his face rearranged itself. Parents learn to read the particular combinations of their children appearing together, and my father had spent enough decades reading us to know that this was not a casual visit. He said, "Come in." We sat in the living room. The shelf with the 2 photographs was visible from where I sat. I looked at Sarah in uniform in that photograph, younger, her expression carrying that particular seriousness of someone who is trying to become the thing they want to be. I looked away. My father settled into his chair and looked at us both. He said, "All right. What is this?" Sarah sat forward on the sofa. I watched her gather herself the way I had watched her gather herself before difficult things all my life. The small straightening, the breath, the decision to go forward. She said, "Dad, I need to tell you something that I should have told you a long time ago, and I need you to let me get through all of it before you say anything." My father looked at her steadily. He said, "All right." She told him everything. She started at the beginning, the enlistment, the early years, what she had been good at and what she had failed at. She described the 2 incidents that Patricia Owens had described to me, though in Sarah's telling they were not abstract facts but specific mornings, specific decisions, specific moments when she had chosen her own judgment over her orders and the consequences that followed. She described the voluntary separation, She described coming home to a story that had already been told for her and not knowing how to rewrite it. She described the letter she had written and never sent. She described the medals. My father sat without speaking through all of it. His hands rested on the arms of the chair. His face did not collapse. It went very still in the way that my father's face went still when he was absorbing something that required the full weight of his attention. When she finished, the room was quiet. Jessica, who had come at my calling the night before, and who had been sitting beside her mother on the sofa, had gone rigid about halfway through. She was 28 years old and she had grown up with a story that I was watching come apart in a living room on a Saturday morning, and she did not know yet what to do with that. My father looked at his hands for a long moment. Then he said, "How long were you carrying this?" Sarah said. 30 years. He was quiet again. When he looked up, his eyes were not hard. They were tired in a way that went deeper than tiredness. He said, "I put that photograph on the shelf because you were mine. Not because of the rank, not because of the uniform. Because you were the child who came from your mother and me, and I was proud of that before you ever enlisted." Sarah said, "I know that now." He said, "You should have known it then." His voice was not sharp. It was the voice of a man stating a fact that had always been true and was only now being said for the first time. He said, "We raised a daughter, not a rank." Sarah broke then. Not noisily, not with the drama of long-suppressed things finally releasing. Quietly, in the way that people cry when they have been waiting so long that the feeling has gone very deep and comes back up slowly. She pressed her hand over her eyes and her shoulders moved, and my father got up from his chair and crossed the room and put his arms around her the way he used to when she was small, and I sat across from them and did not move. After a while he said, into the top of her head, "We will be all right. We will be all right." Jessica had not spoken during any of this. I looked at her. She was staring at her mother with an expression that I could not fully read, something that was not simply anger or hurt but a more complicated grief. The grief of realizing that the story you built yourself around was not the story you thought it was. I said to her quietly, "She failed the military, she never failed you. Those are different things." Jessica looked at me. Then she looked at her mother in her grandfather's arms, and whatever was moving through her was not resolved by what I had said, but it shifted slightly. I could see it shift. That had to be enough for now. The weeks after were not simple, and I will not pretend they were. Truth does not arrive and immediately repair what it finds. It arrives and illuminates the damage, and then the repair has to happen separately, in its own time, through work that is unglamorous and slow. There were people in the community who felt deceived, and they were right to feel that way. The town found out the way small towns find out about things, in pieces, through partial conversations and careful inferences, until enough of the pieces were in circulation that the picture was visible, even to people who had not been told directly. Some of those people were gracious about it, some were not. A man Sarah had known for 20 years stopped speaking to her. A woman she had served on a church committee with sent a note that was kind in its content and correct in its distance. Sarah did not argue with any of it. That was the thing I kept watching and kept being surprised by. The old Sarah, the one who had operated for decades inside a constructed story, had been effortlessly persuasive, had moved through rooms with a confidence that covered whatever was underneath. This Sarah, the one who had walked out of my father's living room lighter and more exposed than she had been in 30 years. This Sarah did not try to manage what people thought of her. She went to the town hall and returned the honored citizen certificate in person to the mayor's office. She wrote a brief, plain letter of explanation that she did not try to make eloquent. She asked that it be kept on file. The mayor, a decent man who had served 2 quiet terms without incident, thanked her for coming and did not make it more than it was. She went to the American Legion. I drove her there because she asked me to. We sat in the parking lot for a few minutes before going in. She said, "I do not know how this goes." I said, "Neither do I." She said, "I was not a veteran." I said, "You were in the military for 4 years. That is not nothing. Even if it is not what you said it was," she said. "It is not nothing. But it is also not what I claimed." I said, "Then you go in and you say that." The post commander was a man named Dwight Caruso, a Vietnam veteran in his 70s with a hearing aid and a handshake that still meant something. He had been one of the people who had nominated Sarah for the Honored Citizen Award. He had spoken warmly about her at the ceremony. Sarah told him what she had told my father. She did not condense it. She told him clearly and without trying to soften the parts that were hard. Dwight Caruso listened without interrupting. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What do you want from telling me this?" Sarah said. "I want to ask if there is a way I can be useful here. Not as a veteran. I know I do not have that standing. But as someone who can drive people to appointments, carry chairs, help with what needs doing, if you will have me on those terms." Dwight looked at her for a long time. Then he said, "Can you be here Tuesday at 8? She said, "Yes." He said, "We have 3 men who need rides to the VA clinic in Pittsburgh. The regular driver has a conflict. Can you cover it?" She said, "Yes." He said, "Then Tuesday at 8. He did not offer forgiveness. He did not offer condemnation. He offered a Tuesday morning and something that needed doing. And I thought that this was perhaps the most honest form of acceptance that existed. Not the declaration of it, but the practice of it. Sarah was there at 7:45. Over the following months, I watched my sister become someone I recognized in flashes and did not recognize at all in others. The flashes of recognition were the things that had always been there: the competence, the care, the instinct for what a situation required. The things I did not recognize were harder to describe. A quality of presence, maybe. A way of existing in a room without performing anything. The architecture of the old story had given her a kind of solidity that I had always taken for confidence. What replaced it was quieter, and less certain, and somehow more solid. She drove the 3 men to Pittsburgh on Tuesday and the 2 men on Thursday, and she helped set up the dining hall for the monthly dinner, and she sorted donated clothing in the back room on Saturday mornings. She did not wear medals. She did not give speeches. A few of the men there knew her history and treated her with a careful distance that she accepted without complaint. A few did not know or did not care and talked to her the way they talked to anyone who showed up reliably and did the work. One afternoon in November, I stopped by to help carry some boxes that needed moving, and I saw her sitting in the parking lot in her car with an older man in the passenger seat. He was in his late 80s, thin, with the careful movements of someone who had learned to be gentle with his own body after a long time of not needing to be. They were just sitting there. She was not talking. He was not talking. They were looking out the windshield at nothing in particular. She had driven him to his appointment, and she was waiting with him until his son arrived to pick him up, and the waiting did not seem to cost her anything. I watched from a distance and did not interrupt. Jessica called me in December. She had been quiet since the morning in my father's living room, processing things in the way of someone who needs time and space before they can put words to what they are feeling. I had not pushed. Emily had called her once, just to say she was there, and Jessica had said thank you, and they had talked about other things. Now Jessica called me on a Sunday evening and said she wanted to talk about her mother. I said, "All right." She said, "I spent a long time being angry, and then I spent some time being sad, and now I am trying to figure out what I actually think." I said, "What do you actually think?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I think I spent my whole life wanting to be her, the version of her that I thought she was. And now I do not have that version anymore, and I am trying to figure out what is left." I said, "What do you think is left?" She said, "I think a lot is left. I think the things she taught me, how to be patient, how to show up for people, how to stay in a room when a room gets uncomfortable. Those things came from her. The real her, not from the story." I said, "Yes." She said, "I think she was braver coming into that living room than she would have been in any war." I did not say anything for a moment. Then I said, "Yes, I think that is right." Jessica said, "I am not ready to tell her that yet." I said, "That is all right." "You do not have to be ready for anything on a schedule," she said. "But I will tell her. Eventually, I just need a little more time." I said, "She will wait. She is good at waiting now." Jessica was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Uncle Mark, did you know it was going to go this way? When you first found out, did you know it would come to this?" I thought about the parking lot outside the grocery store. The call with Patricia Owens. The drive home with the flat gray sky outside the windshield. I said, "No. I did not know anything except that the truth needed to come into the open. I did not know what would happen after that," she said. "What made you do it anyway?" I thought about Emily sitting down beside me on the closet floor, about the letter that had been waiting in the dark for 30 years, about my father saying, "We raised a daughter, not a rank." I said, "Because the lie was carrying weight that belonged to all of us. And because things that belong to everyone cannot stay hidden with one person forever. They find their way out eventually, and it is better to be the one who opens the door than to have the door break open on its own," she said. "I think that is true," I said. "I hope so. There is a version of the past year that I return to when I need to understand what it taught me. In that version, I am standing on my father's back porch on a December evening, late enough that the dinner dishes are done and the guests have gone home, early enough that the night still has some blue in it before it goes fully dark. My father is inside in his chair, and I can see him through the kitchen window, a small figure in a warm room, his hands folded over his middle, his eyes half closed, and I cannot tell if he is watching the evening news or simply resting inside the life he has. Sarah is at the kitchen table with Jessica, the two of them talking over something I cannot hear, and whatever it is not resolved, but they are in the same room together, and their voices are even. I stand there and I think about what it cost each of us to get to this particular evening. The cost was real. I will not tell you it was not. My father carried a pride for 30 years that was built on something that was not true, and learning that has changed the shape of certain memories for him in ways he does not talk about, but I can sometimes see. Jessica lost a story she had organized her identity around, and has had to find new materials, and the building is still in progress. Sarah carries the knowledge of what she chose and what it cost the people she chose it to protect, and I do not think that knowledge will ever fully leave her, nor should it. But I also think about my sister in a parking lot on a Tuesday afternoon sitting quietly with an old man who needed someone to wait with him. I think about my father holding his daughter in his living room and saying, "We will be all right." I think about Jessica saying, "I think she was braver coming into that living room than she would have been in any war." These things are also real. They are maybe more real, in the end, because they were chosen without the protection of any story. What I have come to understand is something that sounds simple, but is not. A lie built out of love is still a lie. The love does not cancel the damage, but the love also does not disappear when the lie does. When you strip away the false thing, the love that was underneath it does not go with it. It stays. Sometimes it is stronger for having been uncovered. My sister is not a woman I thought she was. She is someone I am still learning. That process has been harder than I expected, and also in ways I did not anticipate. Something close to a gift. If something in this story sat with you, perhaps because there is something in your own life that has been carried in the dark longer than it should have been. I would only say this: the people who love you have almost certainly already survived harder things than your truth. They may surprise you. And even if the road to the other side of it is long, it is better traveled in the open than alone in the dark. The truth told late is still the truth. Thank you for spending this time with me. I want to say something about what the confrontation in Sarah's kitchen cost me, because I think it is easy to read a scene like that and mistake the person asking the questions for someone who is not also being broken by the answers. Every answer she gave me rearranged something. Not just the facts of what had happened, but the memory of things I had already lived. Every holiday meal where she had sat at the table in the version of herself she had built. Every phone call where I had asked how she was doing, and she had said fine in that settled way of hers. Every moment my father had looked at her with that particular pride. All of those moments were now something different than what they had been when I was living them. They were not erased, but they had been edited, quietly and retroactively, by the truth sitting across from me in a kitchen that smelled like coffee and autumn soil from the garden. I had loved my sister for my entire life. I had loved the woman I thought she was. Now, I was sitting across from a different woman, not an evil one, not even a dishonest one in the ordinary daily ways that people are dishonest, but a woman who had chosen once, a long time ago, to protect something by covering it, and had then spent 30 years maintaining that cover with the silent effort of someone treading water in a room where nobody knew they were drowning. I did not know yet whether I could love this woman the same way. I suspected I would have to love her differently, which is not the same as loving her less, but which requires learning to do, and learning takes time. What I knew for certain, sitting in that kitchen, was that whatever I felt about it was secondary to what had to happen next. My father was 79 years old and had been proud of a story for 30 years that was not entirely true, and that story was still on his shelf between the two photographs. And it was going to come down one way or another, and it was better for all of us if it came down gently and from the right hands. There is one more thing I should say about Emily. On the evening before Sarah went to my father's house, Emily and I sat on the porch for a while after dinner. It was cold enough that we both had coats on and the street was quiet, and the maple tree in the front yard had lost most of its leaves, and the ones remaining made a dry sound in the wind. Emily said, "How are you doing with this?" I said, "I am not sure. I keep thinking I have found a steady feeling about it, and then something shifts." She said, "That is honest." I said, "I keep thinking about all the years, all the Christmases, all the Sunday phone calls. I keep thinking about how well I thought I knew her." Emily said, "You did know her. The parts you knew were real, the caring, the competence, the way she showed up for people when it mattered. Those were real things." I said, "But they were wrapped around something that was not." She said, "Yes, most people are. Most of us have something in the center that we have covered over because we are afraid of what happens when it is seen." Sarah's particular covering was bigger and longer than most, but the structure is not unusual. I said, "You sound very understanding for someone who identified the problem in the first place." Emily smiled. She said, "Identifying a problem is not the same as condemning the person who has it. I saw what I saw. I told you because I thought you needed to know, but I never thought she was a bad person. I thought she was a frightened one." I said, "She was terrified. Last week in that kitchen she looked more frightened than I have ever seen anyone look." Emily said, because the thing she had been afraid of for 30 years was finally happening. And the terrible thing about finally after all that time is that you discover that what you were afraid of was survivable all along. I thought about that for a while. I said, "Do you think my father will be all right?" She said, "Yes. I have always thought your father was stronger than the story gave him credit for. He was not proud of Sarah because she was impressive. He was proud of her because she was his. When the impressive part comes away, the his will still be there." She was right about that. She was right about most things when she took the time to say them carefully. I reached over and took her hand in the cold, and we sat there for a while longer, listening to the dry leaves in the quiet street. And I thought about how strange and specific it is to love someone well enough that they can say the difficult thing you do not want to hear, and how rare that is, and how lucky. There is something I noticed in the weeks after the truth came out, something I have thought about many times since and have not been able to fully articulate, but will try. Before, Sarah filled a room. She had always filled rooms. When she walked into a space, people oriented toward her the way people orient toward something bright and reliable, a lamp, a window. Part of this was her actual presence, the way she moved and spoke, the calm authority of someone who knew who they were. But part of it, I understood now, was the story. The story had structural weight. It held her up and made her larger and gave the room something to feel proud of by proximity. After she was still present in rooms, but she filled them differently. She took up less space, not because she had become smaller, but because she was no longer trying to fill the space the story required. She arrived and did her work and left without managing what she left behind. It was quieter. It was, I gradually came to understand, more honest in every direction. My father noticed it too. He said to me once, over the phone, that Sarah seemed more comfortable than she had in years. I said, "I think that is right." He said, "I did not realize she was uncomfortable before." I said, "I do not think she realized it either." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Carrying something for 30 years will do that. Make you forget what it felt like before the weight." I said, "Yes," he said. "I am glad it is down." I said, "So am I, Dad." He said, "She came by on Thursday with soup. I did not ask her to. She just brought soup and we watched the evening news and she went home." "It was a good evening," I said. "Yes." "It sounds like it was," he said. "Mark, I want you to tell Emily something for me." I said, "What?" He said, "Tell her thank you from me. For being the kind of person who says the thing that needs saying even when it is hard to say." I told Emily that evening. She did not say much about it. She just nodded and went back to what she was doing, which was characteristic of her. She did not need to be thanked for being who she was. She had always just been who she was and trusted that it would be enough. It was enough.